Hey there, welcome to Night Lectures, your daily dose of fascinating stories. Egypt is one of the oldest civilizations in human history. For 5,000 years, cities were built here, pharaohs ruled, books were written, wars were fought, and people believed in eternal life. This story is not only about pyramids and mummies, but also about ordinary people, about science, religion, and culture, about the rise and fall that the country went through. In this video, we will tell how Egypt emerged, how its culture developed, how it endured wars, crises, and rebirths, who ruled the country, and what happened beyond the walls of the palaces, how ordinary people lived, and why Egypt became important not only for antiquity, but also for the world today. Share your ideas for future videos in the comments and hit the subscribe button. New bedtime stories come out here daily. When you look at a map of the world, it is hard to believe that a great civilization could have arisen in the middle of a desert. Yet Egypt became precisely such a miracle. Around it stretched barren plains, sun-scorched lands where no culture could have survived if not for the great river that carried life through the sands. It was the Nile, with its predictable and generous floods, that became the source of order, time, and the very idea of eternity. Everything that we call civilization was born here, not in spite of nature, but thanks to its precise and dependable rhythm. The Egyptians called their land Kemet, the Black Land. Not because it was dark, but because after each summer flood of the Nile, the river left behind a thick, fertile silt, darker than the sand, richer in life. That silt made it possible to grow wheat, barley, flax, and dates. It allowed people to stop wandering in search of food, to settle, to tame the earth, to remember time, and for the first time, to think about the future. Thus Egypt was born. One of the great discoveries of Egyptian priests was the link between the starry sky and the harvest on earth. Observing the heavens, they noticed that the flooding of the Nile always began shortly after the appearance of the star Sopdet, known to us as Sirius, in the morning sky. This coincidence made it possible to create one of the first calendars in human history, dividing the year into 3 seasons: inundation, sowing, and harvest. Thus, the stars began to dictate time, and with it arose the concepts of order, ritual, and the sacred rhythm of life. Archaeological finds in places such as Nekhen and Nakara show early signs of culture: clay vessels painted with animals, copper ornaments, and amulets shaped like cobras or falcons, symbols that would later become marks of royal power. Here, in the valley of the river, during what we now call the pre-dynastic period, the first cities appeared, along with the notion of power as a divine force, from small settlements of hunters, farmers, and craftsmen. By the end of the 4th millennium before our era, 2 early kingdoms emerged: Upper Egypt in the south and Lower Egypt in the north. Around 3,105 years before our era, the 2 kingdoms united. The ruler of Upper Egypt, named Narmer, later known as Menes, conquered the north and became the first to wear the double crown symbolizing the union of the 2 lands. On the famous Narmer palette discovered at Hierakonpolis, this moment is depicted: the king, in the white crown, strikes down his enemy. This act was not just a scene of victory, but a symbol of the birth of a state founded on unity, order, and divine authority. With this birth came one of the central concepts of Egyptian culture: Ma'at. Ma'at was not a goddess in the usual sense, but the idea of harmony, justice, and cosmic order. It was believed that the pharaoh kept the world from falling back into chaos. If the waters did not come, if the harvest failed, or if injustice prevailed, it meant that Ma'at had been broken, and the ruler must restore balance through offerings, righteous rule, and prayer. Thus the king became not only a political leader, but also the living embodiment of universal law. In this early period, Egyptians began to build tombs, mastabas, rectangular, flat-roofed brick structures where the elite were buried. Inside were placed everything needed for life after death: food, clothing, weapons, and small figurines of servants. The belief arose that death was not the end, but a transition into another world where life continued. These beliefs took shape gradually, but it was during the early dynastic period that the cult of the afterlife began to form, one that would define the entire Egyptian religion. To manage irrigation, taxation, and the distribution of grain required organization. Thus appeared the first bureaucracy, with scribes, officials, grain keepers, and engineers. Writing also emerged, first as pictograms, then as hieroglyphs. Writing was not only a way to record events, but a tool of power, for he who could write ruled. From this moment, Egypt's history was no longer just oral. It was written on stone, papyrus, and wood. Among the first known pharaohs were Aha, Jer, Den, and Semerkhet. Their royal city was Thinis, and they were buried at Abydos, a sacred place the Egyptians considered the gateway to the afterlife. In one tomb, archaeologists discovered a clay seal bearing the image of a scorpion, probably belonging to a ruler remembered in legend as the Scorpion King. The myth of him lives on, but archaeology brings us ever closer to the real person who ruled at the dawn of civilization. Over time, Egyptians came to see their ruler not merely as the intermediary of the gods, but as the incarnation of Horus, the falcon of the heavens. Each pharaoh, it was believed, was Horus in life and Osiris in death. Thus kingship became eternal, like the flow of the Nile. The pharaoh did not simply govern, he renewed the world by his very presence. Through him the gods could be heard, and for him people prayed when the river brought its waters. The first necropolises were built on the western bank of the Nile, the land where the sun set. Egyptians believed that the souls of the dead journeyed there. In these tombs, archaeologists find wall paintings of hunting, harvesting, music, and dance, all that made earthly life worth repeating in eternity. By the end of the 3rd millennium before our era, Egypt had become a unified and powerful state with centralized authority, developed agriculture, writing, and a clear social hierarchy. This was the beginning of what historians call the Old Kingdom, the time when pharaohs believed their power could conquer death. When Egypt entered the era of the Old Kingdom, around the 28th century before our era, its culture already possessed stability, literacy, and a deep religious worldview. Yet the main idea defining this age was that death was not an end, but a continuation. Pharaoh Djoser, who ruled at the start of the 3rd dynasty, around the 27th century before our era, was the first to embody this belief in stone. He ordered the construction of a tomb that would serve not only as a resting place for the body, but as a gateway to another world. Thus in Saqqara rose the Step Pyramid, the first monumental stone structure in human history. Its architect, Imhotep, priest, physician, and builder, would later become a legend and even a god. Djoser's pyramid, about 62 meters high, consisted of 6 steps and was surrounded by a vast ritual complex with courtyards, temples, and corridors over 5 kilometers long. It was not merely a tomb, but an architectural universe where the pharaoh would continue to exist. Then came the kings of the 4th dynasty. First, Sneferu, a ruler whose architects experimented with forms. The bent pyramid at Dashur and the red pyramid, the first smooth-sided structure. But the culmination came with his son Khufu, known to the Greeks as Cheops. He ordered the building of a pyramid greater than anything before, about 147 meters tall, composed of more than 2.5 million limestone blocks, each weighing from 2 to 15 tons, all without iron tools or wheels. The Great Pyramid of Khufu at Giza became the symbol of eternity. Inside are narrow passages, ascending galleries, a sarcophagus of pink granite, and a chamber for the divine boat. Its perfect alignment to the cardinal points still amazes scholars, but more important than its size or precision was its meaning. It was not built for glory, but as a vessel for the pharaoh's soul to cross into eternity. Modern excavations show that these monuments were not built by slaves, but by thousands of skilled workers, stonemasons, brewers, bakers, and physicians, who lived in nearby settlements, well-fed and honored. Their graffiti reads, "The Friends of Khufu," or "The Drunkards of Menkaure." They were free Egyptians performing sacred labor, believing that by helping their king achieve immortality, they themselves upheld the cosmic order of Ma'at. Near every pyramid stood a mortuary temple where priests performed daily rituals and offerings. At the foot of Khafre's pyramid stands the Great Sphinx, over 70 meters long, a lion with a human face, likely Khafre himself, gazing eastward toward the sunrise, the symbol of eternal rebirth. It was also in this era that the pyramid texts appeared, the earliest known religious writings carved into tomb walls, describing the soul's journey and the trials it must pass to join the gods. Later they evolved into the Book of the Dead, scrolls placed in tombs to guide the deceased through the afterlife. All these temples, texts, and images formed a worldview in which religion, power, and art were one. Egypt built eternity not metaphorically, but literally. Yet even the Old Kingdom was not eternal. By the end of the 6th dynasty, internal strife, weakened authority, and droughts brought decline. The pyramids became smaller, inscriptions poorer, and Egypt entered the first intermediate period, a time of fragmentation. But for now, along the Nile, under the burning sun, humanity created immortality. Stone became prayer, the word became a key, and life became preparation for eternity. When the Old Kingdom ended, Egypt did not collapse in flames but dissolved into itself. Around the 22nd century before our era, weak floods and failing harvests led local rulers, the nomarchs, to act independently. Chaos followed, the first intermediate period. Egypt fragmented into small domains, each with its own gods and rulers. From this time come texts like the Admonitions of Ipuwer, lamenting famine and injustice. The poor have become rich, and the noble lie in dust. Revival began in Thebes. There, in the 21st century before our era, Prince Mentuhotep II united the land once again, founding the Middle Kingdom, remembered as a golden age of justice and balance. The 11th and 12th dynasties restored centralized rule, irrigation, and trade. Among their greatest kings was Senusret III, who conquered Nubia, built fortresses, and reformed administration. His statues, with weary eyes and stern features, convey the burden of rule more than divine majesty. Egyptian literature flourished. The instruction of Amenemhat warns heirs against betrayal, while the tale of Sinuch, about a courtier who flees after the king's death and later returns, became the first psychological story in world literature about guilt, exile, and forgiveness. The Middle Kingdom expanded into Nubia, rich in gold, but by the end of the 12th dynasty, instability returned. Then came foreign invaders, the Hyksos, Semitic peoples from the Levant, who introduced chariots and bronze weapons. They ruled the delta for more than a century, but never conquered all of Egypt. Thebes resisted. Pharaoh Seqenenre died in battle. His skull still bears wounds from axes. His successors Kamose and Ahmose I continued the war, and around the 16th century before our era, Ahmose expelled the Hyksos, destroying their capital Avaris and founding the New Kingdom, the age of empire and glory. Now Egypt reached beyond its borders. Under Thutmose I, armies marched to Nubia and Syria. After him came Hatshepsut, a woman who ruled as king, dressed in men's regalia, and reigned for almost 20 years. She built temples, renewed trade, and sent the famous expedition to Punt. Her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri still stands, a monument to wisdom and power. After her came Thutmose III, a brilliant commander who led more than 15 campaigns, making Egypt the greatest power of its age. Tribute flowed in gold, copper, incense, and cedar. Egypt became the diplomatic center of the world. At the height of this glory stood Ramses II, the pharaoh of 70 years of reign and countless monuments: Luxor, Karnak, Abu Simbel. In the 5th year of his reign, he fought the Hittites at Kadesh, one of the most famous battles of antiquity. Though neither side won, Ramses later concluded with them the world's first written peace treaty, copies of which still survive in Cairo and Ankara. In his late years, Egypt remained splendid, though cracks began to show: economic strain, priestly power, and dwindling resources. Yet in his lifetime, Egypt still seemed the center of the world, the land where the sun never died. And soon, amid that sunlit grandeur, would come a ruler who dared to change the faith itself: Akhenaten, who sought a new God and a new truth. In the middle of the 14th century before our era, during the 18th dynasty, a young ruler named Amenhotep IV, the son of King Amenhotep III and Queen Taya, ascended the throne of Egypt. His childhood unfolded at a court steeped in grandeur, architectural ambition, and a heightened sense of ritual. Egypt at that time stood at the peak of its power, yet alongside this rose the influence of the priests of the god Amun, especially in Thebes, where temples expanded and ceremonies grew ever more elaborate and splendid. From youth, the king seems to have doubted the sincerity of that world. He was not so much a rebel as a mystic. At the beginning of his reign, Amenhotep IV took no abrupt steps. He built temples to Amun, took part in rites, and ruled as a pharaoh was expected to do. But already in the 4th year of his kingship, he unexpectedly ordered the construction of new temples, not to Amun, but to Aten, a little-known aspect of sunlight depicted as a solar disk with radiating rays ending in human hands. This cult had existed before, but had never been central. Now the king placed it at the very center of his world. He began to build temples to Aten at Karnak, and it soon became clear this was not an addition to the old faith, but its radical replacement. Amenhotep IV renounced the name that tied him to the god Amun and took a new one, Akhenaten, meaning useful to Aten or the one who acts for the glory of Aten. He forbade the cult of Amun, closed its temples, expelled the priests, confiscated temple lands, and even ordered Amun's name to be chiseled out of earlier inscriptions. This was not merely a religious reform, but a complete remaking of the cosmic order, with a single faceless sun at its core. In the 6th year of his reign, Akhenaten left Thebes and ordered a new capital to be founded in a place where, as he said, no god's foot had ever trod. He chose a desert tract on the eastern bank of the Nile and named it Akhenaten, Horizon of Aten. Modern archaeologists know it as Amarna. The city rose at a furious pace: palaces, temples, administrative buildings, residential quarters, streets drawn toward roofless sanctuaries. Light was to fall freely, for Aten was light, and light could not be enclosed beneath vaults. Artistic style changed sharply. Akhenaten was shown with narrow shoulders, an elongated face, and full hips, a look at odds with the former ideal. Scholars still debate whether this was a realistic portrait or a deliberate allegory, a union of masculine and feminine, a symbol of divine completeness. What is certain is that art became much more alive. In reliefs, we see scenes of the pharaoh and his family eating, kissing their children, praying at noon, receiving the gifts of light. Nefertiti, Akhenaten's wife, stood beside him in all things. Her name meant, "The Beautiful One has come," and her images, especially the famous bust found in the workshop of the sculptor Thutmose, became one of the emblems of ancient Egyptian civilization. She appears not merely as the ornament of a throne, but as an equal, performing rites, governing the country, perhaps even as a co-ruler. Some researchers believe that in her final years, her name was changed to Neferwaten, and that she ruled for a short time after Akhenaten's death, though this lacks firm proof. Akhenaten's 18-year reign unfolded in Amarna, almost cut off from the rest of Egypt. Archives found on clay tablets, the so-called Amarna letters, show that the king intervened little in the affairs of Egypt's Asiatic dependencies. Where once Egypt sent armies, vassals now begged for help and received none. One letter reads, "My city has fallen, and my king has sent not a single soldier. Our enemies mock us, saying, 'Where is the king of Egypt?'" It seems likely that Akhenaten truly focused on spiritual reform, neglecting foreign policy and the old systems of rule. Despite support at court, Aten's cult never took root widely. To ordinary people, it felt distant, abstract, lacking traditional myths, a familiar image, and intercessors. The old gods, with their stories, rites, and closeness to earthly concerns, were banished but not forgotten. Their names were whispered in secret, their images hidden on household walls, their prayers did not vanish from hearts. Egyptians did not embrace a bright but cold monotheism. After about 17 years on the throne, Akhenaten died. Where he was buried remains uncertain. In a rock-cut tomb at Amarna, his sarcophagus and some funerary items were found, but his remains were apparently moved later. Soon after his death, the capital was abandoned, the cult of Aten annulled, the temples destroyed, and the pharaoh's name struck from official lists. His successor was the young Tutankhaten, perhaps a son by a secondary wife, or a concubine. He soon changed his name to Tutankhamun, returning under the protection of Amun. Temples reopened, priests regained power, sculptors returned to the older canon. A campaign began to erase the traces of the Amarna period. Reliefs were defaced, inscriptions bearing Akhenaten's name were recarved, tombs were destroyed, or buried under new layers. It was a restoration not only of faith but of memory, without reforms. And yet, Akhenaten remained in history as the first ruler to deliberately change the religious paradigm of his civilization. His idea of divine light, a single origin, and a personal bond between the human being and the cosmos was revolutionary. Though his reform was brief and his dream of light did not outlive his generation, it left a mark that, thousands of years later, reappeared in philosophy, in the idea of monotheism, in the striving for inward purification. Beside him stood Nefertiti, a woman whose face has reached us across the centuries as a symbol of refinement, strength, and mystery. Her image, like a ray of light fixed in stone, remains a vivid reminder of a time when Egypt not only built temples but tried to rethink the very essence of the world. After Amarna, Egypt was no longer the same. A new century approached, a century of unrest, foreign conquests, and the final twilight of the age of the pharaohs. Egypt would still struggle for independence, but the center of power would begin to drift. And at last, a foreign figure with a Macedonian spear would appear on the horizon, a name that would open a new era. When Ramses II died, a king who ruled for more than 65 years, he was buried in the Valley of the Kings, in a carefully adorned tomb whose walls were covered with spells, ritual images, and scenes from the Book of the Dead. He left behind many sons, countless statues and temples, and above all the image of a pharaoh as a ruler almost equal to the gods. Yet with his death, an entire epoch of confidence, strength, and imperial might came to an end. Soon after came the reign of Merneptah, Ramses' 13th son. He was already more than 60 years old and confronted a new phenomenon, the invasion of the so-called Sea Peoples, whose origins remain debated even today. They were devastating cities across the eastern Mediterranean and sought to enter the Nile Delta. Merneptah repelled them, and on one of his stelae he mentioned for the first time a people called Israel, identifying them as present in Canaan. This passage is considered the earliest written evidence for the existence of the Israelites. But guarding the borders did not mean preserving inner strength. Egypt quickly lost influence in Canaan and Syria, the army weakened, and the throne came ever more under pressure from the priests of Amun, especially in Thebes. The era historians call the Third Intermediate Period began. It lasted roughly from the beginning of the 11th century before our era and was an age of fragmentation, when the country was formally united but in fact ruled by competing centers. In Upper Egypt, the priests of Amun governed, largely independent of the pharaohs. In Lower Egypt, dynasties of Libyan origin arriving from the west seized power. One such ruler, Shoshenq I, appears in the Bible as Shishak, the king who plundered Jerusalem. On the walls of Amun's temple at Karnak are lists of towns he took in Canaan. Yet these campaigns did not restore Egypt's former glory. More and more often, rulers bore dual titles, both pharaoh and high priest, reflecting the tangled nature of power and the weakening of the center. In the 8th century before our era, new rulers entered Egypt, a royal line from Kush, that is, from Nubia. King Pai subdued the country, and with his descendants, including Shabaka and Taharka, a brief revival followed. These pharaohs sought to restore ancient traditions, built temples, and depicted themselves in classical poses, while contending with a rising Assyrian empire. Before long, the Assyrians invaded Egypt, and in the 7th century before our era, their army captured Thebes. Egypt was plundered, and for a time fell under the sway of the Eastern Empire. After the Assyrians withdrew, Egypt briefly regained independence under Pharaoh Psamtik I. His son Necho II launched large reforms, began construction of a canal between the Nile and the Red Sea, and, according to Greek authors, sent Phoenician sailors on a voyage around Africa, a journey that, by some accounts, took 3 years. Yet Egypt's real power remained limited. At the start of the 5th century before our era, the country faced a new threat. In the 525th year before our era, Cambyses, a Persian king, the son of Cyrus the Great, invaded Egypt. His army won at Pelusium, and Egypt became a part of the vast Persian Empire, one of its satrapies under the King of Kings. The Persians ruled strictly but not brutally. Priests continued their service. Temples were not destroyed. But supreme power now flowed from Susa and Persepolis, not from Memphis or Thebes. More than a century later, in the 332nd year before our era, Egypt again became the stage of great change. The army of Alexander of Macedon entered the land without a fight. Alexander was welcomed as a liberator. He visited the Siwa oasis, where the oracle of Amun is said to have acknowledged him as a divine son. Alexander founded a new city, Alexandria, in the Nile Delta on the sea. The city became the greatest port, an intellectual center, and the capital of a new Hellenistic age. After Alexander's death in Babylon, power over Egypt passed to one of his generals, Ptolemy, who founded a dynasty that endured for almost 300 years. The Ptolemies ruled as Greeks, yet adopted pharaonic customs. They took part in rites, built temples for Egyptian gods, and portrayed themselves in traditional iconography. Under them, the Library of Alexandria was established, the greatest storehouse of knowledge in the ancient world, where scholars such as Eratosthenes, Herophilus, and Aristarchus worked. But stability was only apparent. Within the dynasty, conflicts were endless. Brothers murdered brothers, kings married their sisters, and intrigue corroded governance. The Ptolemies depended ever more on alliances with Rome, a rapidly rising power in the West. Egypt became for Rome a source of grain and a stage for political games. Amid the mounting crisis, a figure appeared in whom ambition, charm, and tragedy met: Cleopatra VII. She spoke the Egyptian language, unlike most of her predecessors, took part in temple rites, emphasized her connection to the goddess Isis, and strove to restore Egypt's independence. First, she formed an alliance with Julius Caesar, both political and personal. After his murder in Rome, she drew close to Mark Antony, one of his successors. Their union, in love and in policy, was Egypt's final attempt to remain independent. In the 31st year before our era, at the Battle of Actium, the forces of Octavian, the future Augustus, defeated the fleets of Cleopatra and Antony. The next year, when Octavian entered Alexandria, both Antony and Cleopatra took their own lives. Legend says the queen had a poisonous cobra brought in a basket and allowed it to bite her, to die with dignity. With her death, Egypt became a Roman province. The history of an independent kingdom, one that had lasted for more than 3,000 years, was over. The land was now governed by a prefect appointed by the emperor. The Romans respected the ancient temples but built no new ones. The image of the pharaoh vanished, yielding to the emperor's bust, yet the memory of the past remained. Temples still rose above the Nile. Reliefs on their walls continued to tell of battles, sacrifices, and the sun climbing the horizon. People still brought offerings to Isis, prayed to Anubis, and buried their dead according to ancient rites. Even when foreigners ruled Egypt, the land itself preserved the voice of its deep memory. When in the middle of the first millennium after the birth of Christ, Egypt belonged to the Eastern Roman Empire, it remained a land of memory, but was no longer a source of power. Byzantine rule tried to hold the country as a vital breadbasket, yet growing discontent over taxes, religious disputes, and centralized authority made Egypt's situation ever more precarious. By then, the Coptic Church, a branch of Christianity with ancient traditions, was flourishing in the land, and increasingly clashing with the official Orthodox Church. In the 6th century, news traveled along new roads and caravan routes from the east about a new force gathering in Arabia. In the 610th year, the Prophet Muhammad began to preach Islam. Within only 3 decades after his death, the Muslim army entered Egypt. This occurred in the 641st year, when the general Amr ibn al-As, by order of the Caliph Umar ibn al-Khattab, began the conquest of the country. The Byzantine army, exhausted by wars with Persia and internal strife, could not offer organized resistance. After a long siege of the fortress of Babylon, on the site of what would become Cairo, the Arabs entered Alexandria, and Egypt became a province of the Rashidun Caliphate. The first decades of Arab rule passed comparatively peacefully. Coptic Christians, the majority of the population, were allowed to keep their faith, though they paid a special tax, the jizya. Gradually, the Arabic language displaced Greek and Coptic from official administration, and Islam began to spread slowly but steadily, through trade, administrative advantages, and cultural influence. By the end of the 8th century, a significant portion of the urban population spoke Arabic, and by the end of the 10th century, Muslims formed a majority. For the first 3 centuries, Egypt was ruled by governors under the Umayyads and then the Abbasids. But in the 969th year, a turning point came. The armies of the Shi'i Fatimid dynasty invaded and founded a new city on the site of the ancient fortress of Babylon, Al-Kahira, the Victorious. This city became Egypt's new administrative and religious center. From then on, Cairo remained the country's capital. The Fatimids ruled for more than 2 centuries. Under them, in the 1071st year, the Al-Azhar University was founded, one of the oldest in the Islamic world, which became not only a religious, but also a scholarly center. There, in addition to theology and law, philosophy, medicine, logic, and astronomy were taught. From every corner of the Muslim world, from Al-Andalus to Persia, students, scholars, craftsmen, and merchants flocked to Cairo. The city grew into one of the intellectual capitals of the Middle Ages. After the Fatimids weakened, power passed to the Ayyubids, a dynasty founded by the Kurd Salah al-Din, known in Europe as Saladin. In the 1171st year, he seized power in Egypt and united it with Syria. Under him, the famous Cairo Citadel complex, both fortress and ruler's residence, was built. Saladin entered history as a wise and just sovereign, who repelled the Third Crusade while preserving relative toleration and respect for people of different confessions. After his death in the early 13th century, Egypt came under the control of the Mamluks, a military caste of Turkic and Caucasian origin who had first been purchased as slaves, trained as soldiers, and raised in the Islamic tradition. The Mamluks eventually overthrew their masters and created their own dynasty, ruling Egypt for more than 3 centuries. The first phase, the Bahri dynasty, began in the 1250th year and lasted for more than 100 years. Then came the Burji dynasty, based in the Cairo citadel. Mamluk rule was an age of bloody palace coups and, at the same time, a remarkable flowering of art, architecture, and scholarship. They built magnificent mosques, madrasas, mausoleums, and markets. Their structures, carved in stone and adorned with ornament, mosaic, and calligraphy, still grace the heart of Old Cairo. In this period, Cairo became the largest city of the Muslim world, in population, trade, and cultural life. But Egypt, like the entire East, suffered a terrible blow in the middle of the 14th century, the plague known as the Black Death. It entered along trade routes and over a few years took millions of lives. In some cities, chroniclers say, up to half the population died. Cairo, Damietta, and Alexandria became cities of mourning. The country endured, but the consequences of the epidemic were felt for many decades. In the 15th century, Mamluk power weakened. The economy sagged under declining trade and heavy taxes. Meanwhile, the Ottoman Empire grew stronger. In the 1517th year, Sultan Selim I defeated the Mamluk armies at the Battle of Marj Dabik and secured control over Egypt. He entered Cairo, and Egypt became a province of the Ottoman Empire, though local Mamluks retained significant influence, especially in military matters. In the centuries that followed, Egypt remained an important part of the Ottoman world, a provider of grain, a strategic hinge between the East and the Mediterranean, a religious and commercial hub. Yet it gradually fell behind in technology, military preparedness, science, and education. By the 18th century, Egypt was a land where Ottoman pashas and local beys struggled for dominance, and governance often depended on the whims of the strongest. Even then, Cairo kept its splendor. Its streets swarmed with workshops, markets, fountains, and mosques. Daily life went on, and the ancient past remained woven into the everyday landscape. Columns set into house walls, old capitals propping the roofs of bazaars, sandy mounds under which ruined temples slept. But soon, everything would change. At the end of the 18th century, French ships would appear on Egypt's shores. They were commanded by a man whose name will be heard ever more often in the next chapter, Napoleon Bonaparte. With him, scholars, artists, and engineers would step onto Egyptian soil and, for the first time in many centuries, look upon the stones of the past not as mere ruins, but as a key to understanding one of Earth's most ancient civilizations. For now, however, Egypt is still calm. It lives to the rhythm of the muezzin's call, beneath the vaults of mosques, in the markets and lanes of Old Cairo. It is no longer the land of the Pharaohs, yet not yet an object of archaeology. It is a land where time layers itself without ever disappearing. When in the year 1798 Napoleon Bonaparte landed in Egypt, he arrived not only with an army, but with another much quieter force, a corps of more than 160 scholars, artists, engineers, cartographers, and physicians personally selected for the expedition. With this gesture, Napoleon made clear, Egypt interested him not only as a strategic point in the struggle with England, but also as a source of great knowledge buried beneath the dust of millennia. These people who accompanied the army carried no weapons and took no part in battle, yet they waged another invisible campaign against oblivion, time, and decay. Among them were architects, physicists, biologists, mathematicians, historians, and painters. They laid the foundations of a science that would soon be called Egyptology. Amid the ruins of Memphis, in the sands of Giza, in the temples of Luxor, and in the necropolises of Thebes, these researchers recorded everything that still preserved traces of ancient thought: frescoes, reliefs, hieroglyphs, column forms, tomb layouts, texts on sarcophagi and fragments. They measured, sketched, copied, and described whatever could still be saved from destruction. One of the most fateful episodes of this expedition was a discovery made by French sappers near the village of Rosetta in that same year, 1798. While strengthening the walls of an old Ottoman fort at the Nile Delta, they found a dark basalt slab bearing 3 different inscriptions, in Greek, in Demotic, and in a language then unknown: Egyptian hieroglyphs. The slab, a broken piece of a larger monument, contained parallel text in 3 scripts. Later this find would be named the Rosetta Stone, and become the key that, a quarter of a century afterward, allowed Jean-François Champollion to decipher the ancient Egyptian script. At the moment of discovery, the value of the slab was not fully appreciated, but the French sent it to Cairo. After the capitulation of French forces in Egypt, the British seized the artifact as a trophy and transported it to London, where it remains in the British Museum to this day. While the army fought Mamluks and Turks, the scholarly corps, under colonnades and within tomb chambers, prepared descriptions, plans, and engravings. The result of their painstaking labor was the monumental multi-volume description of Egypt, which began to appear in Paris in the first decades of the 19th century. This work, dozens of volumes with hundreds of illustrations, became the most complete collection of knowledge about ancient Egyptian civilization then available. It influenced European architecture, fashion, art, and thought. A true Egyptomania began in Europe. In London, Paris, Berlin, and Rome, architects drew inspiration from pylons, capitals, obelisks, and frescoes. On theater facades and in museum halls appeared images of Isis and Osiris. Hieroglyphic patterns entered domestic interiors. Literature filled with pharaohs, magic, and sand. Beneath this wave of enthusiasm lay a real desire to unlock a forgotten language and understand a vanished culture. A fundamental milestone in this process was the work of Jean-François Champollion, the brilliant French linguist and polyglot. From youth, he was obsessed with the riddle of hieroglyphs. He studied copies of inscriptions, compared them with Greek names, and turned to Coptic, which had inherited much from ancient Egyptian. And in the year 1822, he made the decisive step. He understood that hieroglyphs were not only ideographic symbols, but also signs for sounds and sound clusters. His breakthrough opened the doors to the Library of Ancient Egypt, long closed and mute. From that moment, an era of archaeological excavation began. In the middle of the 19th century, the Italian-born British traveler and engineer Giovanni Battista Belzoni organized expeditions to the temples of Abu Simbel, Karnak, and Luxor. He removed gigantic statues, cleared passages, raised columns. His methods, by today's standards, were rough, but his zeal and scale are beyond doubt. Egypt began to fill the galleries of European museums. Household goods, sarcophagi, mummies, priestly masks, amulets, all aroused not only wonder, but the thirst to comprehend the civilization that had left such wealth. The loudest discovery of the 20th century occurred in 1922. The British archaeologist Howard Carter, a longtime explorer of the Valley of the Kings, with the support of Lord Carnarvon, found the entrance to the tomb of a young pharaoh of the 18th dynasty, Tutankhamun. It proved to be almost untouched. When the first corridor was opened and Carter peered in, he saw gold and ebony, statues and a throne, chariots and nested coffins, everything that accompanied a pharaoh into the afterlife. Soon the famous golden mask was found as well, which became a symbol of the entire Egyptian civilization. This discovery shook the world. Newspapers everywhere printed photographs of the treasures. The name of Tutankhamun became familiar to schoolchildren on every continent, and Egyptian culture again stood at the center of global attention. But now, for the first time in centuries, Egypt was heard as a voice speaking in the first person, through objects, texts, and meanings given back to humanity. Interest in Egypt became not merely a fashion, but part of science. University chairs in Egyptology appeared. In France, Germany, the United States, and in the land of the pyramids itself, permanent missions worked. A systematic cataloging of monuments began, temple restorations advanced, and texts were translated. Alongside this grew a louder question. To whom do Egypt's antiquities belong? British museums, the Louvre, the Metropolitan Museum, the museum in Turin, all held vast treasures taken in an era when the notion of cultural patrimony had scarcely been articulated. Today, Egypt demands their return, and the fate of such objects as the Rosetta Stone, the bust of Nefertiti, or the golden mask of Psamtik remains the subject of international negotiation. Whatever their future, one thing is clear. Beginning with the Napoleonic campaign, Egypt ceased to be a silent land. Its voice is heard again, in museums and books, in sand and stone, in a language that people learned to read. And in the 20th century it would speak in a new way. From a land of antiquity, it would become a land of revolutions, crises, and a struggle for independence. By the middle of the 19th century, Egypt, once the heart of a great civilization and later a province of the Ottoman Empire, again stood at a historical crossroads. In that period, the ruler was Muhammad Ali, Albanian by origin, appointed by the Ottomans, yet in practice the founder of his own dynasty and a semi-independent monarch. He launched a vast modernization program. He created a modern army, reformed taxation, built manufactories, and introduced a secular administrative system. Under him, Egypt first took on the features of a new era state, aspiring to autonomy. The most momentous event of the latter half of the century was the construction of a canal to join the Mediterranean and the Red Sea. The idea dated back to deep antiquity. Pharaohs such as Senusret III and Necho II attempted related projects, as did rulers in the Hellenistic and Islamic eras. But only in the 19th century, under the Wali of Egypt, Said Pasha, did technology and politics align to make the plan feasible. The project was entrusted to the French diplomat and engineer Ferdinand de Lesseps, who, with the support of Napoleon III, received a concession to build and operate the canal for 99 years. Work began in 1859 and continued for 10 years. Hundreds of thousands of Egyptian laborers participated, most conscripted by corvée. Harsh conditions, lack of sanitation, and an exhausting climate led to the deaths, by various estimates, of between 50 and 120,000 people. The canal opened in November of 1869. Dignitaries from Europe attended the ceremony, including the French Empress Eugénie. For a moment, Egypt stood at the center of the world's gaze, and with that gaze came debts. Ismail Pasha, Said's successor, spent lavishly on grand building and cultural ventures, and in 1875 was forced to sell Egypt's share of Suez Canal stock to the British government. This was a turning point. Great Britain, intent on controlling the route to India, increasingly interfered in Egyptian affairs. After a popular uprising led by Colonel Ahmad Urabi in 1882, British forces landed at Alexandria and seized key positions. From that moment, Egypt was effectively a British protectorate, despite the fiction of continued Ottoman suzerainty. The ensuing decades were full of contradiction. On one hand, modernization continued. Railways and telegraph lines were laid, schools and universities opened, industry expanded. On the other, political and economic dependence on London provoked mounting anger. Egyptians felt their country was ruled from outside and its wealth did not belong to them. During the First World War, Egypt became a strategic rear base of the British Empire. In 1914, after the war began, Britain formally proclaimed a protectorate, severing ties with the Ottoman Empire. Outrage spread, and in 1919, the country erupted in uprisings, strikes, and demonstrations. Saad Zaghloul and the Waft Party led the movement, demanding independence and a voice for Egypt at the post-war conference in Versailles. Under pressure from mass protests and international criticism, in 1922, Britain formally recognized Egypt as an independent kingdom, while retaining control over the canal, the army, and foreign policy. Thus began the era of the so-called independent monarchy. Kings Fuad and his son Farouk ruled in close dependence on the British embassy. Parliament remained weak, economic inequality grew, and corruption spread through every layer of government. Meanwhile, new political and religious movements emerged. In 1928, the Muslim Brotherhood was founded, becoming a major force seeking to unite Islamic principles with social justice and national liberation. During the war that Russians later called the Great Patriotic War, Egypt again became a theater of large-scale operations. In 1942, near El Alamein, a decisive battle took place between Nazi Germany and the Allies. The Allied victory prevented a German advance to the Suez Canal, but further entrenched the British presence. After the war, discontent peaked. In 1948, Egypt took part in the First Arab-Israeli War, which ended in defeat and deep frustration. The prestige of King Farouk, accused of incompetence, collapsed. In July of 1952, a group of young officers calling themselves the Free Officers, led by Mohammed Naguib and Gamal Abdel Nasser, carried out a bloodless coup. The king was deposed, a republic proclaimed, and a new era began. In 1953, Naguib became president, but power soon passed to Nasser. His policy aimed to dismantle the remnants of colonial influence, enact social reform, push industrialization, and agrarian change. He closed British bases and nationalized foreign companies. The most dramatic step was his announcement in July of 1956 that Egypt would nationalize the Suez Canal. London and Paris, which saw the canal as a linchpin of geopolitical control, were enraged. Great Britain, France, and Israel launched a coordinated invasion. The Suez War began. Under international pressure, from both the Soviet Union and the United States of America, the aggressors were forced to withdraw. Nasser's victory turned him into a hero of the Arab world and a symbol of resistance to neocolonialism. The Suez Canal remained under Egyptian control, and from that moment the country possessed real sovereignty, backed not merely by words, but by deeds. Thus ended the long, difficult road from the era of European intervention to the recovery of control over Egypt's own destiny. A land long subjected to foreign empires again claimed the right to choose its future. Yet despite political tempests and changing epochs, the spirit of the ancient kingdom still lived in its soil, as perpetual as the waters of the Nile. When a plane descends toward Cairo International Airport, the window may frame an unusual sight. On one side, a boundless desert where time seems to stand still. On the other, a gigantic city of traffic, neon signs, and millions in haste. Look closer, and within the modern bustle, the contours of another epoch begin to emerge, as though the land itself remembers everything that has happened and refuses to let memory go. This memory is not museum dust. It is the air Egypt breathes. Giza remains one of the clearest symbols of this fusion of past and present. The enormous pyramids and the Sphinx, once standing on a bare desert plateau, are today encircled by Cairo's suburbs. Housing creeps to the bases of ancient monuments, tourist buses crowd the streets, children kick a ball by walls more than 4,000 years old. The Great Pyramid of Khufu, one of the 7 wonders of the world, is, for nearby residents, not a wonder, but a landmark outside their windows, a familiar detail of the landscape. Yet Egypt's legacy is not confined to its most famous sites. It lives in places where tourists rarely tread. At Saqqara, once a vast necropolis, archaeologists dig almost without pause. In the year 2023, more than 50 sarcophagi were discovered there, many with brightly preserved paintings. One contained a mummy with a golden tongue, a ritual symbol meant to let the deceased speak with the gods in the afterlife. Mostafa Waziri, the Egyptian archaeologist and one of the mission's leaders, said in interviews that such finds are becoming more frequent, and each brings us closer to understanding the real daily life of ancient Egypt. Archaeology in Egypt is not an episode, but a way of life. Even amid political upheavals and economic strain, the country continues to excavate, study, and preserve. Discoveries occur every year. A complete mummification workshop with tools here, a tomb of a priestess whose name was forgotten for 3,000 years there. The state supports research, and universities train a new generation of Egyptologists, both local and international. In the 2000s, Cairo opened the National Museum of Egyptian Civilization. Its concept departs sharply from classical museums. Here, history is shown not by dynasties, but by themes: clothing, religion, crafts, death, art. In one hall, you may see a pharaoh's sarcophagus, in another, Coptic icons, in a third, Islamic manuscripts. All this is Egypt entire, without artificial borders between eras. The museum has become a place visited by schoolchildren, scholars, and passers-by wanting to feel the current of millennia. Another project deserves special mention: the Grand Egyptian Museum, the largest museum complex dedicated to a single civilization. Its opening has been postponed multiple times, but by early 2025, a ceremonial opening was planned. Built at the foot of the pyramids, it is conceived as a bridge between archaeological heritage and new technologies. Its collection numbers more than 100,000 objects, including the complete display of Tutankhamun's tomb goods, many artifacts never previously exhibited, and pieces gathered from across the country. The space is organized so that one does not simply look, but feels. The scale, the meaning, the breadth of an age. Egypt's legacy is not only material, it lives in language, in daily gestures, in a way of seeing the world. In villages of Upper Egypt, women still use motifs echoing ornaments from the time of the New Kingdom. At weddings, newlyweds receive amulets in the form of the scarab, a symbol of rebirth and the sun. Elders tell children tales of kings and gods, and in those stories it is not always clear where myth ends and memory begins. Even in Cairo's bustle, there is an inner dialogue with the past. On a single street, a mosque from the 14th century may stand beside an Armenian church from the 19th, with a column a little further on that Romans once brought. In the Madaria district, amid apartments and fruit kiosks, you can find the obelisk of Pharaoh Senusret I, nearly 4,000 years old. No one builds walls around it, no one restricts access. It simply stands as it always has, while children play nearby, unaware that their games unfold at the foot of great history. The modern Egyptian is proud of the past. This pride is neither formal nor imposed from above. It comes from within. In conversation with a taxi driver or a market vendor, you may hear, "We gave the world mathematics, architecture, writing. The phrase sounds not like boasting, but like the natural awareness of belonging to a great heritage. Even in political debates, in street slogans, in the names of cafes and companies, words like Pharaoh, Anubis, and Pyramid appear. Here, history is not past but present. Perhaps this is the key difference between Egypt and other ancient civilizations. It has not become a ruin buried beneath ages. It continues to live, changing, renewing, arguing with itself, yet not betraying its origins. Egypt is not only ancient temples dusted by time, but also the guide's voice explaining to schoolchildren who Imhotep was. It is not only bas-reliefs, but also a cafe overlooking the Luxor temple, where one can drink tea beneath columns carved in the time of Amenhotep III. When evening falls and Cairo's streets pause for the cool, when the Nile reflects the lights of bridges and minarets, it becomes clear. Time does not destroy here. It lays memory down in layers like sedimentary rock. Egypt is not a frozen mass of history. It is a river flowing through the millennia, forgetting neither its sources nor its course.